Okay, what's going on here, AP Human Geo? This is our political geography review. I'm going to go through the review questions. Special surprise for all of you. If you're following along, I already have the answers in red on the review sheet here for you as well. So I've done the work for you. If you bother to watch the video, you'll be able to have the answers provided for you for this particular test. Okay. Let's get started. A lot of questions. I want to make sure we get through them as quickly as possible. So be able to explain the difference between a nation and a state. What's a city-state, a nation-state, a multinational state? What's sovereignty? What's a stateless nation? What's the only landmass on the planet that's not claimed by another state? Okay. So a state is an area on Earth's surface that is organized into a political unit. It has boundaries/borders. The people or the government there, it's ruled by a government. That government has sovereignty, which means they have decision-making or control. They are recognized by the other states around the world as well. A nation has nothing to do with actual land. A nation is a group of people that have a common ethnicity and a common political identity. So a state is a place. A nation is a group of people. All nations do not have states. We know that, right? For instance, there are stateless nations out there. The Palestinians are a good example. The Kurds are a good example. So you need to be able to differentiate between the two. One is a group of people. The other is a place that is inhabited by a group of people permanently. A nation-state is when the political boundaries of a state correspond to the territory occupied by a particular nation. So if your country is made up primarily of one nationality, overwhelmingly, and I would usually say like, about 90%, around that number, maybe 85, 90% of your population is made up of one nationality, you're most definitely a nation state, because the borders of your country seem to line up with the borders of this one nationality, this one nation of people. Sovereignty, remember, is just decision-making. It's power over your internal, what's happening inside your borders, and your external, what's happening outside of them. So sovereignty is decision-making of a state. In order for a state to be recognized, remember, its government must have sovereignty. Otherwise, it's just chaos, right? And competing claims as to who is in charge. Self-determination is when a nation or ethnic group is able to vote to determine who their leaders are going to be. So if a country decides for itself who its leaders are going to be, it has self-determination. They decide by themselves who their leadership is going to be. Whereas if another state or power determines the leader in a country, then that country does not have self-determination because an outside presence or factor is determining who the leader will be. What's the only landmass on the planet that's not claimed by any state? That's Antarctica, if you remember. Antarctica, according to the United Nations, is international territory that nobody has a claim to. Now, you'll remember that a bunch of countries do have claims on Antarctica. They're just not recognized by the rest of the world. I think what they've done is they put those claims there in the event that later on Antarctica is broken up, is opened up to claims. Those countries would be able to say, hey, we had the original claims. We were here first. We thought these belonged to us before anybody else did. So that would give them an advantage maybe in trying to claim that territory down the road. Next up, describe colonialism, imperialism, and how they led to the development of European empires around the globe. What's decolonization? When did it occur? And what is a buffer state? Okay. Colonialism is when you impose your political, economic, and cultural control on territories that you previously didn't have, that you now claim sovereignty and legal control over. So if you are a country, there's a piece of territory that you want, you claim it, you take it, you control it, you impose your political system, your economic system, and your cultural systems on that territory, you claim legal control over it, then that is a colony of yours. All right? Imperialism is the building of an empire around the world made up of multiple colonies that you have claimed. So colonialism is the act of obtaining colonies and imposing your political, economic, and cultural control on them, and claiming legal control. Imperialism is the building of a colonial empire around the world. to demonstrate your power, your economic power, your political power, to try to spread your religious or your cultural traditions to new places. Usually imperialism occurs because countries are competing against one another for power and land. And this is a way for them to try to increase their colonial control. The most famous example of imperialism occurred in the 1500s, when European countries like Spain, Portugal, England, France engaged in a massive, rapid competition to acquire North and South America, Africa, and parts of Asia as well. Decolonization is the decision by a state to give up all of its colonies, to grant their colonies sovereignty over their own affairs, or to grant their colonies independence. The good examples, of course, are England and France, although most or all European countries began to decolonize in the 1900s. Even the United States decolonized when we gave up possessions like the Philippines that we had acquired previously. Latin America, for the most part, decolonized, which means won their independence in the first half of the 1900s. The United States, Britain, Spain, Portugal controlled most of the territory in Latin America. One by one, those countries gave sovereignty up over their colonies in that area, and each of those individual countries, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, like Panama, are all able to, over time, declare independence. Asia and Africa, decolonization happened after World War II. So we know colonization in Africa started with the Berlin Conference in 1884. It doesn't really end until the 1950s that we start to see African countries made independent. European countries abandoned their claims in Africa, and those countries again were, Britain, France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, even to a lesser extent Spain, although not as much of a power there as they were elsewhere. So Africa wins its independence in the 1950s and 60s. And ultimately, that's when decolonization took place. Last question, what's a buffer state? A buffer state is like something that's in the middle or in between two rivals. So for instance, if two people were going to fight and you stood in between them to hold off the fight, to prevent it from happening, you are a buffer, all right? You're in between them. So a buffer state is a state that exists to divide empires or superpowers from having direct boundaries, I should say, with one another. So again, if you have two countries or empires that are historically confrontational, that they like to fight against one another, well, one of the things that you can do is you could draw lines, draw a country, create a country with new boundaries that physically separates the two rivals to make it less likely for them to have a border conflict, to make it less likely for conflicts to take place between both sides. Okay? What's state morphology? State morphology is the shape of states and the impact that can have on matters both inside and outside of that state. All right? Remember, large states are usually called mega-states. Small states are usually called micro-states, if you remember. Micro-states are usually the smallest states around the world. Most of them are oftentimes islands. A compact state, a fragmented state, well, we can go through these shapes if you'd like. A compact state is very simple, right? It doesn't matter about its size, it matters about its shape. Its shape is relatively compact, so circular or maybe square-shaped. Usually what this means is as you go further from the center of the country, it's about an even distance, a uniform distance towards the outside areas. There's no particular area or region of that country that is further away, that is separated. So if you're a compact state, usually most of the time you don't really fall into any of these other categories. It's considered the perfect or the ideal state shape because obviously you don't have areas or regions that are separated or isolated as much. Excellent for communication, excellent for defense, excellent for transportation systems, which are more easily connected together, usually assists in development if you have a compact state. Again, because you don't have a region that's more or less developed than the rest based on geography. A fragmented state, remember, is a state that has a fragment, has a piece that's separated from the rest of the country. That can be separated by water or by land. The United States is a fragmented state, right? Because we have Alaska, of course, that's fragmented and not connected to the rest of the country. Of course, we have Hawaii as well, which would be another fragment of ours that this time is separated by water. Again, biggest issue with fragmented states is, well, the fragment is not connected, which can oftentimes mean there's more devolution in that area. And for instance, we have like a Hawaiian independence movement where some native Hawaiians want to be independent from the rest of the country. Communication, transportation, defense, all can be harmed, right? They can be hurt by this fact that there's a fragment that's separated from the rest of the country. Oftentimes, in fragmented states, it's the fragmented area where we see more tension, more conflict. It's more of a trouble spot. It's more of a shatter belt region, all right? Because they don't feel as closely connected to the rest of the country, politically, culturally, and sometimes economically. Elongated states are long and narrow. Remember, they usually need to be about 3 times longer than they are wide at their widest point. Again, they are usually not as easy to defend or to communicate all areas with, to develop transportation systems, to connect. There's less unity, especially in the outer areas, right, that are further away from the center. Those elongated areas, north or south or east or west, that are far away, that are less connected, usually have the same negative problems that a fragmented area would. In addition to that, goodness, what are you doing over there? All right. In addition to that, elongated states, right, are sometimes easy to take over. They're hard to defend, right, because they're so narrow, especially if they are surrounded by adversaries, by rival countries. A perforated state, remember the Swiss cheese, it has a hole in it that is another country or another piece of land. Again, a perforated state has a hole or a perforation in it that belongs to another country. Obviously, South Africa, good example. Italy, good example of perforated states. Prorupted states, remember, has a tentacle or an appendage that protrudes outward in a weird way from the rest of the country. Usually, proruptions happen in order to give a country access to sea areas, to ports or to oceans. Sometimes a proruption is created to give countries access to resources they otherwise wouldn't have. And sometimes a proruption can be created as a buffer to separate 2 other rival states from having a border with one another. All right, so prorupted states always kind of look funny to us. They look like a tentacle or an antenna or an appendage that's jutting outward. All right. Remember that an enclave is a country or a piece of a country that is completely surrounded by another country. So again, an enclave completely surrounded on all sides by one other country. It doesn't have any access to the sea, doesn't border or connect to more than one country. It's physically separated, entirely encircled by one other country. All right. An exclave, if you remember, is just a piece of a country that is separated by land area from the rest of the country itself. All right. So again, Vatican City is an enclave because it is completely surrounded by Italy. Lesotho is an enclave because it's completely surrounded by South Africa. However, Swaziland would not be considered an enclave, right, because it technically has a border or a boundary with 2 countries. Alrighty. So an enclave, again, completely surrounded by one other country. An exclave is just a piece of a country that's physically separated from the rest of it by land area. All right. So, so in theory, I believe all enclaves are exclaves, but not all exclaves are enclaves. All right. Landlocked state, remember, is when a country has no sea access or sea area. Obviously, that can be a negative as well. You don't have access to ocean resources. You don't have a coastline, right? You don't have the ability to trade as well with other countries around the world. You're dependent on your neighbors, right, for food, for supplies, for defense, for communication, for transportation. So again, landlocked states have the same problems a lot of time that enclaves and exclaves do, right? All of those issues we just talked about. You're really dependent on your neighbors for political help, for military help, for economic assistance, for trade, for defense, right? You better have a strong relationship with your neighbors. All right, difference between boundaries and frontiers. What are the two major categories of boundaries that divide nations? So boundaries are clearly marked lines that are agreed on by neighboring states, and they are recognized by the rest of the international community, the rest of the world. All right. Frontiers are more of an undefined area or region that exists between two states. They're oftentimes disputed. There are not clearly marked lines that separate the two. There's usually just more of a general agreement as to where the boundary is. And so therefore, boundaries usually are more well known. They're more clearly marked. They're more defended, whereas frontiers are usually in uninhabited or undefined areas, usually areas that maybe have a lot of mountainous or desert terrain. And it's really just an unclear area. Now, we don't have a lot of frontiers anymore. Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were a lot of frontiers, a lot of boundary regions that were disputed or undefended or unclear. Those have gone away now with the development of GPS and other, advanced technological map-making abilities. We've seen most frontiers disappear during this time. Some people believe Alaska is a frontier. All right. Some people might argue, I suppose, that the oceans are still a frontier, at least in international waters. But we really don't have a lot of frontiers left in the world. All right. What are the three steps in the process of two nations accepting a boundary and putting it on the map? Definition, remember, is where two countries get together and they define, usually on paper, what the boundary is going to be between themselves. All right, so it's a general agreement that's done on paper where they define for the very first time what they will agree the boundary is going to be. All right, that's a first step. Then delimitation. Delimitation is when you actually delimit or mark that area on Earth's surface. Now, you can do that with, stakes. You can do that with a fence. You can do that with a wall. You could do that with just markers. You could be like the United States and Canada and just, if you remember, plow a line across the border area. It's really up to the two countries involved how they want to delimit it, which means physically mark it on Earth's surface. And then demarcation, remember, is, I guess you could say, how you choose to operate your border. All right? Do you guard it? Do you keep it open? All right? Do you physically man it? Do you leave it unmanned? Are you going to allow open border kind of movements? So it's kind of how you demarcate. All right. So again, define how you're going to define it on the piece of paper. How you're going to agree to a treaty to define what it is initially. Delimitation is where you actually physically determine what the line is. All right, and you begin to equate the line to actual physical places on Earth's surface. And then demarcate is actually, I guess you could say, operating along that line as well. All right. Describe three types of physical boundaries. I believe there was another. What are the two major categories of boundaries? Yeah, I skipped that on the previous question. The two major categories of boundaries are physical and cultural boundaries. All right. Now, let's get to this question. Describe types of physical boundaries. Physical boundaries are boundaries that are that separate groups of people based on a physical feature that exists there. So water boundaries, mountain boundaries, desert boundaries, those are all physical boundaries. Water could be, a lake, it could be river that physically separates two places. Mountains are pretty clear. A mountain or mountain chains might be one of the physical boundaries. A desert oftentimes was a physical boundary between two places because it was so difficult to travel through. It was so dry. It was so arid. It was inhospitable to people. So water, mountain, desert are good examples of physical boundaries. Generally, physical boundaries make a lot of sense because there's a natural physical barrier there that can divide two places. What are three types of cultural boundaries that exist? Well, You've got geometric boundaries, of course, right? Which are cultural boundaries that are drawn usually based on a straight line, because there's no other natural way or physical way to divide an area, so people will just do it geometrically for the sake of ease and efficiency. Other types of cultural boundaries, religious boundaries where boundaries are drawn specifically to separate two or more religious groups from one another in an area. Language boundaries are boundaries that are drawn because there's no physical feature, or they choose to just use language as a cultural factor to separate two or more groups of people. All right? So geometric, religious, language are all considered types of cultural boundaries. What are maritime boundaries and how they've been generally determined in modern times? Remember, maritime boundaries mean ocean boundaries. That's what maritime means. They are boundaries that determine control of the seas. Almost all nations except, remember, the United Nations Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, in determining their maritime boundaries. Remember, it was finally established in the 1970s. What it says, a state has territorial waters, right? Their territorial seas extend 12 miles off their coast. Remember, that means all of their laws, legal systems, and rules, all of their military control, all of their airspace, all of their policies extend 12 miles off their coastline. Basically, 12 miles in all directions from their coastline is an extension of their country. And then every country has an EEZ, which is an exclusive economic zone that extends 200 miles outward. What that means is everything within 200 miles of your country, of your country's coastline, I should say, is technically all resources in those waters, all access to fish and to other ocean products, all access to resources in those areas, all belong to your country. If they're outside of 200 miles, remember, they're in international waters. They are shared resources according to the United Nations. Remember, if a country is located less than 200 miles from their rival, or really less than 400 miles away from their rival's coastline, we use the median line technique where we decide right down the middle, right? So if two countries are 100 miles from one another, we'll use the median line technique, and we'll say these 50 miles are your EEZ, these 50 miles are yours. All right? What's a choke point? A choke point are areas. That's not even really a good definition of choke point. Anyways, I will delete that right there and talk about choke points down when we need to talk about them. All right? So that's maritime boundaries. That's how they've been determined by the United Nations. Obviously, most nations follow the 12-mile rule for territorial laws and the 200 for EEZ. Remember, there's a lot of disputes, a lot of conflict. The most common, the most famous, of course, today is in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands. Describe the 4 historical classifications of boundaries by famous political geographer Richard Hartshorne. So that's a name you need to know. Richard Hartshorne is a famous geographer. He focused on boundaries, and he came up with these 4 categories that we have covered in class. Okay. Antecedent boundaries, remember, are boundaries that were established before an area was settled. So if we want to establish boundaries before a region has a lot of people living in it, to maybe prevent border conflicts or disputes from occurring ahead of time, we create an antecedent boundary. Our western boundary with Canada, everything west of the Great Lakes, was an antecedent boundary. It was really established before that region was well settled. Didn't have a lot of people living in it yet. And the whole goal was, hey, we've had border disputes so far in the Great Lakes region, so why don't we establish all of our western boundary now to try to avoid conflict in the future? Subsequent boundaries are boundaries that are the opposite. They are established after an area has been well settled. Usually subsequent boundaries are created because there's been dispute or conflicts in a region, and we're trying to resolve them, we're trying to stop them after the fact. And so we're trying to come up with boundaries that occur after and subsequent to the area being settled. Superimposed boundaries, remember, are boundaries that are decided by an outsider, oftentimes during colonization, imperialization. Superimposed boundaries were used by Europeans because they were the easiest and the most logical to draw. They didn't really focus on any cultural factors like language, ethnicity, religion. They were just easy for map makers to create who otherwise didn't have a lot of knowledge about the places they were dividing. Superimposed boundaries lead to a lot of problems in regards to maybe splitting up ethnic groups or combining ethnic groups together who otherwise shouldn't be. It leads to resources oftentimes being separated or eliminated. It can lead to, again, to ethnic tensions. It can lead to language or religious groups being separated, which obviously is going to reduce unity and support for the country in which those people are living. All right. And then relic boundaries, remember, are boundaries that were established in the past. There is still some physical relic or remains of those boundaries on Earth's surface, but they no longer technically, officially divide two states. The Great Wall of China is a great relic boundary because it's no longer used as the boundary between China and Mongolia. The 17th parallel in Vietnam, which used to separate North and South Vietnam, they are now divided. They are now united today, so that boundary no longer applies because Vietnam is just one country today. All right. Oh, describe the 4 types of boundary disputes between nations. Okay. We've got definitional disputes, right? Remember, that's where there's a dispute over what the boundary is in terms of signing. They can't even agree on a treaty. They can't even agree on paper as to what the boundary area is going to be. Definitional disputes usually mean 2 countries that have long-standing disputes, and they can't even begin the process of establishing their common boundary because they can't even agree on the boundary area on paper in a treaty format. All right. Locational disputes are, remember, where there's a disagreement over the actual physical location of a boundary on Earth's surface. So again, please remember, if they've agreed on a treaty in paper version where a boundary is going to be, but then they get out there on Earth's surface and there's maybe a disagreement over this 100 yards of space and who it belongs to, who gets this and who doesn't, then that's a locational dispute because now the disagreement isn't in the treaty on paper. The disagreement is, okay, physically on Earth, this is ours or is this yours? Operational disputes, remember, are disputes that occur when 2 countries that have a border can't agree on how to operate the border. If one builds a big fence, if one militarizes or militarizes means that you arm your troops and you have them kind of ready to fight against the guys on the other side. If you open your border to free border movement, whereas the other side refuses to, that's an operational dispute. The U.S. has some operational disputes right now, obviously, with Mexico over how our border will operate with some of these changes in our country. Obviously, Palestine and Israel have had some major operational disputes as well, as the Israelis have built more walls protecting some of their spaces from Palestinian territory. Allocational disputes, remember, are disputes over natural resources that exist along a border region. So if there's a dispute over oil or natural gas or minerals or water that exists along a border region, that's an allocational dispute because they're fighting over the allocation of the resources that exist there. Supranationalism, what is it? Well, we covered it. Remember, supranationalism is when a country voluntarily gives up sovereignty in order to join an international organization. Why? Because they feel like they're getting benefits from that international organization. Those could be political benefits, economic ones, military ones. They feel that it's better for them to join an international group where they're going to have one vote in that group than to have complete, absolute sovereignty over all decisions and be by themselves, be isolated from the rest of the world. So that's all supranationalism is when you join one of these organizations. What's an example of a global organization? The United Nations. The UN is our only truly global organization. Remember, its primary purpose is peacekeeping and promoting development and stability around the world. What are examples of a regional economic organization? The European Union is our most famous. It's where the countries of Europe have united and formed one economic unit. where they vote and make economic decisions together as a group. Some of the things they've done, remember, is they've eliminated borders between member nations, so there's free travel and transport across those borders. Remember, they've gone to a single currency, the euro, to make it easier to buy and sell goods, and to avoid kind of disagreements or differences over the money that's being used in each country. Of course, remember, there has been a little backlash to some of these economic organizations. For instance, the British, Brexit, have tried to leave this organization because they think they've given up too much control to other countries over their economic decisions. Other economic organizations you could be familiar with are NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, right, between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. No tariffs, right, so no charges against one another for selling our goods there. And cheaper prices. Of course, the negative for countries like the United States is oftentimes factory jobs, manufacturing jobs have relocated from the United States to Mexico, or even sometimes to other countries. Other economic organizations, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, remember, who have oil as a resource. They will sometimes team up together to determine how much oil they should be producing to control the cost or the price of oil around the world. Regional military organizations, well, the United States has NATO, remember, our defense alliance with Canada and with Europe. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Our rival historically, if you remember, was the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union and their allies in Europe. Fortunately, when the Soviets collapsed in the 1990s, so did the Warsaw Pact. Other military organizations that we have CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. We have the OAS, the Organization of American States with Latin America. Other military organizations that exist is the African Union, which is made up of African countries that team up for defensive and even sometimes economic cooperation as well. All right. What is devolution? What three forces tend to speed up the process? So devolution is when a group in a country or regions of a country try to break away, I guess you could say. They're not loyal, they're not united with the rest of the country, and they oftentimes want self-rule or sovereignty for themselves. Give an example of the three forces that tend to speed up the process, and an example of each. Ethno-cultural forces would be if the area or the region has different ethnicities, different languages, different religions than the rest of the country. There's less loyalty to that government and to the rest of the people, and so oftentimes they will devolve, which means they will move away from the rest of the country and want to form their own political unit. Economic forces that can play a part are when, for instance, one region of the country is very wealthy compared to the rest of the country or is very poor compared to the rest of the country and doesn't really want to be connected or attached to it any longer. If you're much wealthier, right, you feel like your money is being taxed or taken and given to other regions, and you're being kind of used by the rest of the country. Your wealth is being used by the rest of the country in a way that you're uncomfortable with. More commonly, what happens is that a region is poorer, is less developed, is more economically isolated from the rest of the country, and there's a movement in that area. Well, if we declare independence, if we break away, we would make better decisions that benefit us instead of benefiting the other regions so much. And then spatial forces. Oftentimes a region might be separated from the rest of the country by physical factors like mountains, right, or by lakes, or maybe they're fragmented from the rest of the country, and they can that can be a factor, a spatial reason why they might want to separate from the rest of the country. How does democratization play a role in the spread of devolution? Look, people always want sovereignty for themselves. They always want decision-making for themselves. And so the idea of democracy is very powerful in causing groups to maybe want to break away from the rest of the country if they feel they could have more say, more independence, and more choice over the matters that are happening. What's irredentism? Irredentism is when a state tries to regain territory that they had previously lost, or when the people that live in this territory would like to be part of the original state again. All right. So, for instance, when Mexico lost territory to the United States during the Mexican-American War, all the way up until today, there are some Mexican citizens who believe that some of that territory ought to still belong to them. And they would actually like to see the United States give up some of that territory and give it back to Mexico. Adolf Hitler, when he rose to power in the 1930s, he talked about how Germany had lost so much territory after World War I. And those were Germans, he said, that were separated or isolated from the rest of the country. And he promised to get those regions back. So he took Austria back. He took parts of Czechoslovakia back. He later invaded Poland. Because he had said, we're going to unify all German people, we're going to bring our country back, we're going to make it stronger again after it had been broken up and divided after World War I. That is Irredentism. It's a powerful tool that can be used by a country or by a leader to motivate the people, to empower the people to want to maybe go to war or to use force to take back territory that they had lost. All right. Recently, after the Soviet Union fell, an area in the Ukraine called the Crimea, which had belonged to Russia, was given to Ukraine. Over the last few years, the area was, by the way, the area is almost all Russian. And if people speak Russian, they identify as Russian, but they technically belong to Ukraine. Well, what did Russia do a few years ago? They invaded Crimea. They took it claiming, hey, the people there want to be part of Russia. This land was taken from us against our will after the Soviet Union fell, and it really ought to be ours. And so Irredentism is a powerful tool. It is still used today. The Russians used it in order to seize Crimea from the Ukraine just a couple of years ago. Know what geopolitics is and be able to describe the following geopolitical theories and the person who's responsible for each. I've really hit on all of these, but the sea power doctrine, remember Alfred Thayer Mahan, the idea that in modern times a strong, powerful navy, a modern navy, is key to world domination. You must have military bases around the world and a navy that can reach and protect and control those bases, the sea lanes between them. You want bases. You want navy that can get to what they are called the world's choke points. Those are the areas where most of the world's sea traffic moves through, like the Panama Canal, like the Suez Canal, like the Sea of Japan or the South China Sea. And if you have a strong navy, you can guard, patrol, and protect those areas and give your country an advantage in terms of military protection, in terms of trade and protecting your trade around the world as well. All right. The organic theory, remember, was Friedrich Ratzel. It was a German theory that if your country, strong countries, healthy countries are expanding, they're taking over more territory. Weak countries are generally dying out, which means they're losing their territory, they're getting conquered by others. It was a theory that was very aggressive, led to a lot of expansion, and was supported by leaders like Adolf Hitler and the Soviets as well, and Joseph Stalin and the Soviets when they decided to take over much of the rest of Europe and to try to eventually, when Hitler tried to invade the Soviet Union. Speaking of which, the Heartland Theory, Halford Mackinder, the idea that Europe and portions of Asia and Africa are one big world island, as it was called, and if you control the world island, you dominate the rest of the world. In order to control the world island, Mackinder said you had to control the heartland, which was the area in Eastern Europe and Russia that had a lot of the world's population and a lot of the world's resources. In order to do that, you had to be a strong land power because you had to control these huge amounts of land. Much of that land was protected from naval attack by icy waters, or by the fact that the land was you had to go across land in order to seize the heartland. It was the idea that Napoleon and Hitler and others, one of the reasons why they invaded that area was so that they could control this heartland because they believed in this idea. The Soviet Union really expanded on this and seized the heartland and controlled that, made that their center of power while they were around. during the Cold War as well. The Rimland theory is the opposite. It says the key to world power is actually the rimland, the area around the heartland, because if you control the rimland, you can control the coastline, you can kind of squeeze or suffocate the heartland areas, prevent any goods or people from getting in and getting out. The rimland is more of a modern theory. It's connected to the sea power doctrine. It was developed by Nicholas Spikeman, and it is... it's much more powerful today. It was the policy the United States used during the Cold War. It's one of the reasons why we still have such a powerful Navy and why we have military bases, especially naval bases, all around the world, especially in the rimland areas that surround the heartland. The world system theory, I haven't covered it in class. It's really just the idea of core and periphery. Remember, we covered this during development. The core countries are the developed countries of the world. They make most of the economic, political, and military decisions. The rest of the world is called the periphery. Those are the less developed areas that are further away from the developed countries, both economically and physically. And they are less significant, I guess you could say. They supply a lot of times the labor and the resources, while the core countries tend to gain the wealth, tend to make the decisions, tend to become the most powerful. So world systems is just core periphery. All right, that's all it is. The world system theory says that the core countries of the world dominate, make the decisions by which the rest of the world, the periphery, does the work. Be quiet there, Ginner. Next up is the Domino Theory. How did it lead to containment? Remember, the Domino Theory developed during the Cold War. When the U.S. was fighting against communism, the U.S. was fighting against the Soviet Union. The Domino Theory was the idea that communism is like a disease. It's like a set of dominoes. When it falls, when communism spreads to one country, and that country falls to communism, those that are around it are more likely to fall to communism as well. So because we believed in the domino theory, because we believed that to be true during the Cold War, we tried to prevent the spread of communism out of the heartland. We were willing to allow it to stay in the heartland regions. We just didn't want it to spread into the rimland because we felt like once it spread there, it was like a disease. It would slowly infect all of the other countries of the rimland as well. It's one of the reasons why we went to war in Korea in the 1950s, because communism spread to North Korea, and then they tried to invade the South. We tried to prevent that from happening because we didn't want communism to spread into a new place in the rimland. We went to war in Vietnam as well, or for the same reason. Because we were worried that North Vietnam was communist. It had spread to North Vietnam. They were in a fight with South Vietnam. We did not want communism to spread to a new region where it didn't exist, Southeast Asia. So we went to war to physically try to prevent that from happening. We think domino theory is a flawed theory today. Just because a country is communist doesn't mean it automatically is going to spread to those around them. For instance, Cuba has been communist for, 75 years, but no other countries around Cuba in the Caribbean or the United States, obviously, have never become communist as well. However, at the time, we thought it was true. We practiced containment, which means we contained the spread of communism. It was like we tried to put a big invisible container over the heartland. And as long as the communism stayed there, we were cool with it. But a moment that we saw communism kind of leak out or try to spread to a new region, we did everything we could to contain that, to prevent that, to push that spill back into the heartland again. All right. What's the difference between unilateral, bipolar, and multipolar world in regards to geopolitics? Be able to give an example of each. Okay, a unilateral world is where there is just one major superpower. After the Cold War, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and really before China rose to the position that they're in today, there was really just one superpower, the United States. That was a unilateral world, where one country had a great deal more geopolitical control than anybody else. A bipolar world is simple. It's when there are two superpowers at the same time. So during the Cold War, we were a bipolar world, which means the U.S. and the Soviet Union were by far the two most powerful countries. They were rivals with each other, and then the rest of the world kind of joined one or the other side. So bipolar, right, like a North and South Pole, where there's two countries that are much larger and more significant, and everybody else is kind of attracted to one or the other. And then a multipolar world is where there are multiple superpowers, all right? Before World War I, when there was, the British and the French and the Austrians and the Germans and the Russians, even the Turks, the Ottomans, they were all, even the Italians to a certain extent, they all kind of balanced each other out, the United States as well. There was nobody that was significantly stronger or larger than anybody else leading into World War I. And that's a multipolar world where they kind of balance or check each other's power, where there's not one dominant country around the world or even two dominant countries. Power is more spread, shared, and even and balanced. All right? I'd say we're kind of more of a multipolar world today in that the United States and China and Europe, because of the European Union, and even Russia to a certain extent, are all kind of superpowers that help to kind of balance or check each other. What's the difference between a unitary and a federal state? A unitary system is a government that's very centralized. Decision-making is controlled by the national government. So, for instance, France is a unitary state. Almost all major decisions in France occur in the capital, Paris. The national government makes those decisions, and they pass them down to the various regions or provinces of that country. So the individual regions and provinces don't have a lot of say. They don't have a lot of power. They don't have a lot of sovereignty or decision-making. Almost everything that occurs in that government is done so in Paris by the national government, who then pass those decisions down to the rest. Federal systems are where political decision-making is split between the national government and the various states or region. The U.S. is a federal system. Power is shared between the national government and the government of the 50 states. The national government has some power that's given to it by the Constitution. Anything not given to the national government in the Constitution belongs to the states. All right? So, for instance, the national government has control over our borders, all right? But since the Constitution didn't say anything about education, the states, each of the 50 states, sets their own education policy and decides what their students will actually learn. That's a federal system where power is balanced or shared between the various national and then lower level governments. England is considered a federal system. Generally speaking, larger countries with more land area are usually federal because it's a larger country, so it's harder to control politically, and so they tend to give more power or more sovereignty to the various regions or areas of the country so that those countries feel like they have more of a say in the decisions. Smaller countries with a smaller land area, usually are more likely to be unitary, so that the government doesn't have to worry as much about control and loyalty and avoiding devolution in their country. What is electoral geography, and what are some of the ways the U.S. government influences electoral boundaries? Well, remember, we redistrict, which means that every 10 years, we look at how the population has changed. Where are we? There we are. We look at how the population has changed, right? And we say, okay, this state gets more seats, more representatives in Congress. This state gets less. That's called reapportionment, when we reapportion how many representatives each state has. Then, if you remember, what do? We redistrict, which means we redraw the boundaries in that state in order to determine what the new voting boundaries are going to be, in order to take into account those extra representatives or the representatives that they lost. So reapportionment is where we look at census results and we decide, okay, this state has gained people or lost people, and so we're going to either give them or take away some of their representatives in Congress. Redistricting is after we've reapportioned, we redistrict or we redraw the lines in that particular state to represent the new voting districts, all right, that now exist because we did reapportionment. Gerrymandering, remember, is when you redraw voting districts, right? Well, first off, the government influences electoral boundaries through gerrymandering, which we'll define with the next question. And then one other way that the government tries to influence electoral boundaries is they will protect the voting rights of minorities like African Americans in the United States. If we feel like a group, especially an ethnic group, has been denied voting rights or voting access, maybe states have blocked them from voting, maybe they've tried to scare or intimidate them from voting with Jim Crow laws and things like that, the federal government can step in and kind of protect or monitor to make sure that minorities in an area are being allowed to vote and their votes aren't being influenced or quieted. All right, what is gerrymandering? What are the three types? Gerrymandering, remember, is the redrawing of voting districts, redistricting, in order to give one person or group a better chance of winning in the future. Usually it's done by the political parties in charge so that they can give themselves advantages in future elections as well. Remember, there are three types of gerrymandering. The wasted vote. Remember, wasted vote is when you try to split up the weaker political party or the minority political party so they do not have a 50% majority anywhere to try to prevent them from winning any congressional seats. Excess vote is where you lump as many members of the minority political party into one region or a few regions to give them those regions, but to prevent them from winning any others because so much of their voters have been stacked, or I should say placed, in this one or these few regions. So you recognize, hey, we're not going to win every election if you're the majority party when you excess vote, but we want to win as many as possible, so we're going to stack as many of our opponents' voters into one or as few districts as possible to give ourselves as much of an advantage in all of the others. Stacked voting, remember, is when you link otherwise very distant groups of people together into one region. Usually this is done to guarantee that a certain ethnic or religious minority group actually has representatives in Congress. For instance, if it's a state that does not tend to elect African Americans, but a large percentage of the state is African American, we might create stacked voting districts that are called majority minority districts that will at least give some representation to those ethnic minorities in that state. So remember, we have African American majority minority districts that have been created by using the stacked vote method of gerrymandering. We also have Hispanic Latino ones. We also have Native American ones, for instance, in places like Arizona. All right. What's terrorism, and what are some of the methods that terrorists use to achieve their goals? Terrorism is attacks upon innocent civilians. Well, attacks upon the public, attacks upon civilians in an effort to try to achieve some sort of political outcome or religious outcome by a group. How is it different from assassinations or attacks on world leaders? Well, because assassinations and attacks on world leaders are designed to specifically target one person. They're designed to target, a military leader or a political leader, a decision maker in a particular country. Terrorism is more general. It's not specifically targeting one group or individual. It's usually just trying to cause as much damage, as much terror, as much fear as possible, so that the people inside of a country lose faith in their country's ability to protect them, to guard them, to be able to take care of them. All right? Methods terrorists use to achieve their goals: assassinations, bombings, hostage-taking situations, all right, are very common. Like we said, hostage-taking, sometimes executions of those hostages, bombings, random attacks on public places, anything that a terrorist group believes will cause the people in a country to lose faith in their government's ability to protect them from these attacks. All right? Describe the following terrorist attacks that have occurred against the United States and explain which person or group was responsible for each. Okay, the Lockerbie bombing occurred in England. It was when a Pan-American plane that was filled with American and European travelers blew up. There was a bomb aboard it, and it blew up over England, technically over Scotland, over the United Kingdom in the 1980s. It turned out that the Libyan government was responsible for finding and hiring terrorists who were then trained. They loaded bombs aboard this plane in the storage area. They blew it up. Why? because they were upset with the United States and England's support for Israel, and they were upset that the United States considered their leader, Muammar Gaddafi, to be a terrorist organizer. And they were upset the United States had, for instance, launched some bombings, some attacks on some of Gaddafi's homes or possessions in Libya. All right? So that was a bombing of a plane by radical Islamic terrorists that were being supported by the government of Libya. The first World Trade Center attack was also another Islamic bombing. It was a bombing of the Trade Center, the Twin Towers. This was the first attempt that failed. What happened was they tried to blow up a truck in the parking garage underneath the Trade Center to try to bring the building down. They did blow up the truck. It did kill a few people, but it was unable in bringing the World Trade Center tower down that time around. So, of course, what happened was another group tried it a few years later with a different method with airplanes, and they were successful. The group that was responsible for the first World Trade Center attack, again, was a group of Islamic terrorists. They were being led by a radical Muslim cleric / religious leader who was living in New York City at the time, who kind of motivated them to engage in this attack. Other attacks you need to be familiar with. The Federal Building was attacked in Oklahoma City. This was another truck bombing where a Ryder truck, a moving truck, was loaded with explosives and was blown up. This was actually done by a white American terrorist, a domestic terrorist. His name was Timothy McVeigh. He was a former Army soldier, a former military guy who was upset with what he thought was our federal government violating people's rights and their freedom. He was obviously very disturbed. And so he blew up the Federal Building, which was a building where most of the federal government's offices, courthouses, and things like that were located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Hundreds of people died, including children that were killed in a daycare nearby. So that's an example of how not all terrorist attacks are done for religious reasons. Not all terrorist attacks are done against the United States by people of Muslim descent. This was a white Christian American, a former soldier, who engaged in this horrific attack as well. Also, the destruction of American embassies in Africa. So we had bombings that occurred in Tanzania and Kenya by a group in the 1990s and early 2000s called Al-Qaeda, which we'll get into in a little bit. They blew up trucks that were loaded with explosives at American embassies in Africa. At the time, this was when Al-Qaeda was just really getting started. We didn't really recognize or realize how strong and how dangerous an organization they were. All right? What are domestic terrorists? And give some examples in the United States. Well, domestic terrorists are attacks that are inflicted by on a nation by citizens or inhabitants of that nation. Usually these are people that have become radicalized, that have turned into radicals, and suddenly want to target people within their own country. Examples, well, we already talked about the Oklahoma Trade Center bombing, right? Which was done by an American citizen. In addition to that, the Unabomber. This was a dude who kind of felt like we were becoming too technologically dependent. He thought that the United States had sold out to corporations, especially technology corporations. They had too much power and influence over society. He lived in a cabin. He produced these homemade bombs. He would send them oftentimes through the mail to people that he didn't care for, that he thought were involved in spreading policies that supported technology and corporation companies. And so he was responsible for mail bombings, from bombings that were sent through the mail, bombs that were sent through the mail. The person opened up the package, boom, they were blown up. It turned out he was a really intelligent, well-educated former professor who had moved out to the West and had lived in like a rural area in a cabin. All right. Anyway, he's in jail today. His name was Ted Kaczynski, by the way. And then eco-terrorists. There are some radical ecological groups in this country that have targeted logging companies, timber companies. They targeted corporations like oil companies. who they believe are destroying the environment, and so they will conduct terrorist attacks against businesses or corporations that they think are destroying or damaging the environment. They're really radical. Things they'll do, for instance, is in the past they would put like metal blades and things like that in trees, and so when loggers would come by to chop that tree down with their high-powered electric saws, the saw teeth would become disconnected from the saw when they hit these metal pieces that the people had jammed into the tree, and oftentimes those saw pieces would come back at the actual timberman, which could cause injury or death to him. All right. Another thing they will do sometimes is go into like auto dealers that have like Hummers or other gas guzzling cars, and they will kind of start some of those on fire or try to damage or destroy those as well. More recently, domestic terrorists in modern times have more likely been Muslim, and they've been radicalized online by messages they've seen from ISIS or Al-Qaeda, through Twitter or Facebook or other social media, and they're motivated to commit attacks in the United States when previously they wouldn't have considered doing so. Folks, what's considered to be the worst attack on American soil? And briefly describe what happened. Well, that's the 9/11 attack for sure. What happened was 20, I think it was 20, 19 or 20 terrorists from Muslim countries in the Middle East were able to get into the country. Most of them came as temporary visitors or students, and then they were basically they were put into teams of 5. They hijacked 4 different planes at about the same time, and of course they flew those into high-profile, significant sites in the United States that are associated kind of with American political economic dominance, right? So they flew 2 of them into the Twin Towers, brought those Twin Towers down. They flew one into the Pentagon, which is the center of all of our military decisions in this country. And then, of course, we believe they were headed for the Capitol or the White House with the 4th plane, but of course that went down before it could reach its destination. Thousands of Americans died, close to 40, like 4,000 Americans, including hundreds and hundreds of police officers and firefighters that were trying to fight the damage, the blaze that occurred there, trying to help people to evacuate. It was a shock. It was a stunner. Why did the attacks take place? Well, because the United States, in the minds of these terrorists believed the United States supported Israel. They believed that we were trying to force our Western cultural customs on them, and that we were somehow modernizing their society in a way that they were uncomfortable with. A lot of these folks are fundamentalists, right? Religious fundamentalists who believe in a very strict traditional interpretation of their book, the Quran. They viewed the United States as an imperialist country, dominating their culture, forcing their young people to become more westernized, and to them that was unacceptable, and they conducted these horrible, horrific, horrendous acts against the United States to try to cause fear, intimidation, and quote-unquote pay the United States back. What group is responsible for most of the terrorist attacks against the United States in the 90s and 2000s? That group was Al-Qaeda, which we will cover tomorrow in class, but it was in your notes. Al-Qaeda means the base, right? Remember, it was founded by a guy named Osama bin Laden, who was a very, very wealthy guy from an oil family in Saudi Arabia. Remember, originally he and others had fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan with the help of the United States. Of course, after the Soviet Union fell, these guys turned their attention towards the United States because they were opposed to the U.S.'s support for Israel. And again, because they develop a very radical fundamentalist view of Islam and believe the United States was weakening Islam around the world. After the death of bin Laden, the United States finally was able to kill him, about 7 or 8 years ago. The Al Qaeda has definitely fallen in popularity. It's been replaced by another group called ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. A lot of the old members of Al Qaeda joined ISIS, so it's a lot of the same guys we were fighting previously. ISIS wants to create a country with sovereignty that would be a strict, harsh, religious, fundamentalist government. Remember, Al Qaeda was a loose terrorist network, all right? So they would have cells in Asia. They would have cells of terrorists in the Middle East. They would have cells in Africa. So it's not like one organization. It's really a bunch of different terrorist groups around the world that have this kind of unofficial relationship with one another, where they stay in contact. Hey, this is what we're planning. This is what we're planning. This is what we're planning. But if you destroy one of those cells, one of those pieces of the terrorist group, all the other ones are so independent of it, they're still able to operate on their own as well. So it's not as simple as just killing the leader. You have to hunt out and root out each of these terrorist networks, each of these cells, as we call them, that exist in a different part of the world. A lot of times you destroy a cell, and it can quickly be replaced with new members that arrive there and take over and start to do the same operations again. So it's difficult to defeat terrorism. It's so difficult. It's not like you're fighting against guys wearing specific uniforms. It's not like you're fighting against guys or even ladies sometimes that you can figure out who's the friend and who's the enemy. The whole goal here is deception, confusion, fear, intimidation. And it's difficult to fight a terrorist campaign to know friend from foe. The big difference between ISIS and Al Qaeda is, to be honest with you, ISIS is much more wants to actually create their own homeland, their own country. They've tried to establish their own boundaries. They've tried to establish their own Islamic law in the places that they control, although they've been incredibly weakened in Iraq and Syria. In fact, their two major strongholds are about to be taken over by Iraqi troops with U.S. help. All right. What is state-supported terrorism, and what are ways that a state can support terrorism in other places? Okay, so state-supported terrorism is when a country actually supports terrorist attacks or terrorist groups in their country. There's different ways that this can be done, all right? One, a country can allow a terrorist group to live or stay within their boundaries. They're giving them protection. They know that they're being hunted by other countries. And so they're going to protect them by allowing them to stay within their country and, in theory, to have safety from outside attack. Afghanistan gave safety to Al Qaeda, allowed Al Qaeda to set up bases and to operate in their country so that they could not be killed or hunted by the United States. It's one of the reasons the U.S. declared war on Afghanistan, so we could go in there and we could try to find ISIS. All right. Other ways that a state supports terrorism, they might give money, they might give weapons to terrorist groups to help those terrorist groups to go and engage in attacks. Now, here, the country is not actually coordinating the attacks. They're not planning the attacks, but they're giving money, they're giving weapons to that terrorist group to allow them to do the attack and to conduct the planning and all of the operations as well. A third way that a state can support terrorism is to actively plan terrorist attacks, to recruit, to train, to actually have terrorists that work for their country that they train to go out and conduct attacks in other places. This is a thing that some countries are willing to do because they can train these terrorists. They can have them go out and conduct the attacks. And then if the attack takes place and they get blamed for it, they can say, what do you mean? These weren't our soldiers. These weren't our guys. We have no idea why they did that attack. We had nothing to do with this. So again, provide safety. You can provide money and funding to terrorist groups, or you can directly plan and participate in terrorist attacks that you have organized. All right? Skinny, relax, baby boy. How are each of the following states supported terrorism globally? All right, well, how do each of these states conduct or support terrorism? Well, Libya, remember, they were the ones who actively planned and trained terrorists to conduct that Lockerbie bombing in Scotland. They also had trained terrorists directly and funded them to go and blow up a nightclub in Germany as well that had a lot of American soldiers that used to go to it. So that's an example of the third type, where the state actively trained, supported, raised, recruited terrorists to go and conduct attacks on its behalf. The U.S. and other countries reacted harshly to Libya. We bombed their leader's homes and his other possessions. We tried to do these things in retaliation for him supporting these terror attacks around the world. About 5 or 6 years ago, this leader was actually captured by members of his own country. His name was Muammar Gaddafi, and he was actually assassinated by them. Afghanistan, remember, when it was under the control of the Taliban, which was a religious fundamental group, they gave safety, sanctuary to al-Qaeda because they knew al-Qaeda was being hunted by the U.S. and other groups after the 9/11 attack. So here, Afghanistan's government simply allowed the al-Qaeda to operate within their country. It gave them safe haven. It gave them protection to open bases where they didn't have to worry about being targeted by the United States. Right? So they kind of protected them from attack during that time. Iraq is a country that we believe, under Saddam Hussein, their old dictator, was actively funding terrorist groups. He was giving money. He was supplying weapons to terrorist groups that he thought, he was a Sunni, so he would support Sunni groups that he thought would keep Shiite Muslims under control within his country. He also conducted attacks directly against Shiites and Kurds in his country. Most of those were done with chemical weapons, which were considered to be a major violation of United Nations law. Iran is actively training, is actively giving money, we believe, and weapons to Shiite Muslim groups, terrorist groups around the world, so that they can resist and fight against Sunni extremists and radicals as well. We know that Iran is supplying, for instance, some of the Palestinian groups against Israel. All right? And then Pakistan, well, Pakistan's believed to be providing sanctuary to anti-Indian terrorists who have attacked India and attacked the Kashmir region. So Pakistan, we believe, is providing sanctuary to some of these groups, which means safety, allowing them to stay within their borders, within their boundaries. And then to cross the border, to attack the Indian troops, to race back across the border to try to reach safety again. All right, those are just a few examples of state-supported terrorism that exist, but obviously there are a lot that we have covered throughout the year thus far. All right, guys, that's Mr. M signing off. Hopefully this was helpful to you. I really hope it was. All right, you take care now. All right, study hard. Test is a-coming.